Everyone, thank you for tuning in to the Postmodern Realities podcast, brought to you by the Christian Research Institute and the Christian Research Journal. I'm Melanie Cogdill, managing editor of the Christian Research Journal. Happy New Year! It's January 2022, and we have got another year filled of great content on this podcast for you. This is episode 269, and it's going to be a spoiler-filled conversation about the film The Matrix Resurrections, which is in theaters now and on HBO Max for several more days. Today's guest is Cole Brigette, who is a recent seminary graduate. He is also a graduate of the Moody Bible Institute and an author for the website Christ and Pop Culture. Cole has written an online exclusive film review for the Christian Research Journal. His article is called The Matrix Resurrections, Self-Awareness and Romance in the Digital Age. Now, normally, this kind of article is an online exclusive and only available to our subscribers, but we want to, in this new year, give you a taste of what some of our exclusive content is like and encourage you to subscribe. So this particular review is available for everyone for free at our website, equip.org. And if you're not already subscribing, please go to our website, equip.org, to subscribe to get more of this online exclusive content. Cole, it's good to have you on.
Always good to be here.
Well, of course, everyone knows that the Matrix series itself has had a resurrection with this new fourth film. Everyone thought Neo and Trinity had died. Those are the two main characters at the end of the last film, almost 20 years ago. In fact, the last two sequels were released the same year, almost 20 years ago. And so, of course, people are talking about if this is continuing the exact same story or does it have new twists for the 21st century. And I really want to go back to the beginning. So what exactly is Matrix? Can you give us a little bit of background into the series, and why has it just retained this really, I would say, devoted fan base, and really it is well regarded in terms of cinematic history for the way that it was so audacious at the time in its storytelling?
Sure. So The Matrix began as a 1999 film that ended up winning something like 4 Academy Awards. I'm pretty sure it won in every category it was nominated in. And all of those categories were in things like visual effects and sound design. So it's a film that really remembered for pushing the technical boundaries of what science fiction and action-adventure films could be. It made use of things like slow motion and these wild martial arts and gunplay, very much influenced by Eastern cinema as much as it was by science fiction. And it was all blended into this package to make for a really memorable viewing experience. The basic premise of the film series goes something like this. In this distant future, these sentient machines have enslaved humanity and uses human bodies as an energy source, batteries, basically. And the way that these machines keep humanity enslaved is by keeping their minds uploaded to a computer-generated reality called the Matrix. Now, inside the Matrix, people live out their lives, and it looks very much like our world does now. People have jobs, families, and they are completely unaware that they even exist inside of this computer program just waiting to be harvested by these machines. Well, some humans have found a way to break free of the Matrix and rebel against the machines, so the broad narrative of the series deals with this war between humanity and machines, and the free humans are trying to free the minds and rescue the people still trapped inside the Matrix. Now, the story proper revolves around a man inside the Matrix named Thomas Anderson, who moonlights as a computer hacker called Neo. And Neo begins to encounter these freed people inside the Matrix. And that's the real gimmick, the really fun part about these movies. Because a person who was freed from the Matrix can actually re-enter the Matrix of their own accord. But because their mind has been freed and they understand that none of what seems real inside the Matrix is actually real, they understand that it's just a computer program, they can actually begin to bend the rules of the system. So inside the Matrix, if your mind has been freed, you can break the laws of physics. Characters can run up walls, dodge bullets, and have the ability to fly. So Neo is freed from the Matrix by these people who believe him to be this long prophesied messianic figure called the One. And it's said that this one, whoever he or she is, will be able to end the war between humans and machines. And that's basically the Matrix in a in a nutshell.
Well, in terms of just the amalgamation of all these different ideas within the Matrix, in terms of some of the themes that were in the original film, it became very widely popular in religious circles and, people who follow philosophy and things like that, philosophical nerds, I'd say. So people started writing on it and talking about what it actually meant. And that includes ourselves as well, because the Christian Research Journal published an article that was a cover story called The Matrix: Unloaded Revelations. And it did go on to win an Evangelical Press Association award at the time. But what are some of the ideas that people took from the film and some of the discussions about what the film was about? And why do you think it was so captivating to everyone?
I mean, you could really spend probably another 2 or 3 episodes talking about this. The original Matrix trilogy is one of my absolute favorite film series. I know people weren't crazy about the sequels, but I really like them and still do. I think these are wildly imaginative and bespoke films that are original and are not the product of corporate mishandling. They very much feel to me personally like Lucas's Star Wars movies in terms of being the product of a singular creative vision. The originals are good. The sequels, or in the case of Star Wars, the prequels, don't work for everyone, and that's okay. But in terms of what captures people, especially the brainier, more academic side of things, is the way that these films will incorporate philosophy and ethics, things like that. I mean, let's be honest, The Matrix is really remembered in the broad culture for bullet dodging and slow motion. But there is a serious philosophical bend to these movies that is uncommon in these big action blockbusters. The Matrix is, in a sense, a thinking man's movie wrapped up and packaged in an early 2000s action movie skin. And chief among these philosophical interests, and this is where Christians always sit up and begin paying attention to, is the discussion about predeterminism or predestination and free will. Now, most movies that try to deal with these themes are pretty trite and usually err on the side of choice. Eternals, for example, does this, one of the films we just talked about recently. But The Matrix does not offer such easy answers. 9 times out of 10, I would say that the average viewer will muddy the waters of trying to interpret a film by thinking too hard about it. That 1 time out of 10 exception is something like The Matrix, where you do have to actually watch carefully and really pay attention to the dialogue in order to really understand what these films are about. And these movies, including the new one, have always been about the seemingly disparate ideas of complete autonomy and choice and free will, and predestination or fate and destiny, and how these two ideas interact. These films do not err on the side of one or the other. Instead, they challenge viewers to change their perspective or to think about and perhaps change how they think about opposites. If you go back to the very first film, when Neo visits the Oracle, he meets this young boy who is spoon bending, which was a very popular magician's trick in the 1970s. And the conversation Neo has with this boy ends with the boy basically telling him that he has to realize the spoon isn't real and that the world of the Matrix is a construct and that the spoon isn't actually bending, but it's his own mind bending the spoon. In other words, he has to change how he's thinking about reality in the first place, and that is what is going to enable him to do much more than bend spoons. Then immediately after this, right, Neo goes to visit the Oracle, and her first words to him are to tell him to ignore this vase. He sort of turns to see what she's talking about, and in the process of turning, knocks over this vase and it shatters. And he asks her how she knew that was going to happen, but her immediate response to him is to ask this: well, had I not told you to ignore it, would it have happened in the first place? In other words, would it have not happened had she not opened her mouth? So you can see how these ideas really attract people who like to think probably a little too long and hard about things. But what I've always appreciated about the series is that it does not try to reduce the conversation to a simple answer, which is what most other films tend to do. If anything, the solution these films offer is to stop trying to reduce such things to a simple answer and change your reductionist perspective. Lots to muddle through in a film series like this. Like I said, you could spend hours going through it. I mean, there really are college courses out there that deal with these movies and their themes, so that's just a little insight into what the movies deal with and sort of what I think grabs people about them.
Well, I think one of the infamous scenes, I would say, in the first Matrix, which is kind of repeated in a different way in this film, is when he meets the person Morpheus in the first one, and he offers him the red pill for truth or the blue pill to keep doing what you're doing. And, I don't know if that's supposed to be, maybe it's just the pills themselves, or is it an illusion of the choice that he has? But I find it interesting that this time they pretty much show, well, these blue pills are just, they just multiply in terms of what's happening to him where he is in some simulation. I'm talking about Neo, which is now, instead of a computer hacker, just cog in the wheel, he's now a famous video game designer who's designed these games called The Matrix. And so when you think about, and you talked about the spoon incident, I find it interesting that in this one, when he's finally realizing he's kind of waking up to, wow, what I've been in, this is simulation. Now I'm really in the real world, that he doesn't remember how to fly like he did in the last one, or he's wondering if he can remember Kung Fu, or he doesn't really feel like he's too tired to continue. Why do the writers and the filmmakers have that kind of thing, like where he tries to fly and, he couldn't do it? When just prior to that scene, there's been quite a bit of time where other characters are, dodging bullets and running up walls and so forth.
I think there's a couple reasons given for it in the narrative. And just let it be said, these films typically warrant multiple viewings and careful watching. But from what I can recall, having seen it, two things. By the time they find him again in Resurrections, Neo is very far gone from where he used to be. And he's sort of been like extra suppressed by the Matrix and by the analyst, the villain of this new film especially. And so it takes him a little bit of time. I think the way the film frames it is to get his mojo back. But more than this, one of the things we learn is that some of the anomalous coding that sort of constitutes Neo originally is imbued in Trinity, the other individual who is resurrected in this film. And so, in a sense, he's split. The powers have become split so that she now has some of what he had, and the only way to really access them is for them to be together. And that's touched on here and there throughout the narrative. So those are the reasons for it that I tracked, at least narratively.
Well, thank you to everybody who participated in our contest for a free subscription to the Christian Research Journal. We are really grateful for those comments on Apple Podcasts that let people know what you appreciate about this podcast. And what I'm going to do right now is I took all the names that entered in between June 1st and December 31st, 2021, and I put them into a random picker wheel, and I'm going to spin that wheel right now and tell you who the winner is of the subscription. So here we go. The winner is Clever Joe with a K, K-L-E-V-E-R, Joe. If that is you and you're listening, you can claim your free subscription to the Christian Research Journal by emailing us at webmaster@equip.org. And in the subject line, please put winner free Christian Research Journal subscription. We will email you back and ask you who should receive that subscription, whether it's yourself or you'd like to give it to somebody else. So thanks again, everybody, for participating. Now, we welcome those comments on Apple Podcasts all year round, even without a contest. Although in 2022, it's a new year, of course, and we will run another contest of something. I'm not sure exactly what. It'll always include a free subscription to the Christian Research Journal, but it also might have some other swag in there as well for you. And so you can also subscribe to our journal at equip.org for $33.50. Also, helping us out by giving us a tip really helps, even if it's $3 or $5 or $10. You can also do that at equip.org. Very easily find magazine at the drop down, go to Postmodern Realities. At any one of the landing pages, there's a link to give us a tip, and we'd be very grateful for that. And of course, the best way to get the word out is just simply tell a friend or link your favorite episodes or ones that have really caused you to think about things onto your social media accounts and let people discover this podcast. So thanks again for all the entries and Happy New Year to you all. So let's get a little bit into this actual film, The Matrix Resurrections. As mentioned, it's been almost 20 years since the last Matrix movie, number 3. Can you talk a little bit about how this particular film continues the story of the previous films, and what is the premise of it, and what has changed in this new film?
The Matrix Resurrections is the 4th film in the main series. It is technically, I guess, the 5th film in the Matrix series. There was an animated prequel sequel film released way back in the day called The Animatrix, which ironically contains my favorite bit of Matrix media, this short film called The Final Flight of the Osiris, which leads directly into the events of The Matrix Reloaded. Anyway, that's not what you asked. The Matrix Resurrections. Okay, so this film picks up some 60 years after the 3rd and final film of the original trilogy, which is The Matrix Revolutions. Now, at the end of Revolutions, Neo and his mate, Trinity, are killed at the expense of ending the war between humans and machines. And this peace is achieved through their sacrifice, and a new iteration of the Matrix begins at the end of that film. One in which people who desire to leave the Matrix will be allowed to do so. You fast forward 60 years to Resurrections, and it turns out that Neo and Trinity have been rebuilt and kept alive by a machine program called the Analyst, played in this film by Neil Patrick Harris. After Neo brought about a truce between the humans and the machines in the previous trilogy, there was a mass exodus from the Matrix. People chose to be free, and the machines suddenly lost their primary source of energy. So this machine civil war broke out. Some machines rebelled and joined with the humans, while the Analyst took control of the Matrix and used Neo and Trinity as the primary power sources for this new version of the program. So the film begins with Neo and Trinity both back inside of the Matrix, and everything that happened in the original trilogy, Neo struggles to remember. It's treated inside this new Matrix almost like a mental illness that he's in therapy for. And there is this group of renegade free humans led by a new character called Bugs, who have been searching the Matrix for Neo because they believe he's still alive. So, of course, he's found and freed from the Matrix a second time. And the plot of the film is really about him then trying to rescue Trinity, who is still trapped inside the Matrix under the control of the Analyst. So this is very much a sequel to the originals. It is not a reboot or a relaunch or anything like that. It is a continuation of the story.
Which is really interesting because as I read reviews, some reviewers said, this is really The Matrix 2.0. The first film all over again is 2.0. But I think you would argue that it's not that. And I don't know, you mentioned the Animatrix. I don't know how many non-Matrix aficionados know that these series of little anime films, I think all the films together only run about 90 minutes. Well, first of all, they're available on Netflix. So if anyone wants to watch them, you can find them there. But also that they kind of tell you the story before where we pick up when the Matrix opens.
Yeah, the Animatrix was sort of designed to answer all your burning questions, but it sort of flew under the radar. But it was released right around the time the second and third movies came out back in 2003. I mentioned it has one of my favorite little pieces of Matrix media called The Final Flight of the Osiris, which is just this little short tale of heroism featuring Captain Thaddeus and his first mate Jew, who sort of sacrifice everything to get this message to Zion. And it leads directly into the inciting incident of the second film. One of the things the Matrix series has done very well for since it began, is continuity. It maintains its continuity. Practically every piece of extended media, from the animatrix to video games, play key roles in the story. For example, there was a video game that came out back in the day called Enter the Matrix, which actually follows a whole storyline alongside the second film. There's some events in the second movie that sort of happen off screen, and the video game covers the events of that. So it's always been very good. The series has always been very good about maintaining that continuity across multiple properties as the years have gone on.
There's a lot that's in this film that I want to talk about. First of all, I would really want to address the notion that it's quote unquote, that hip word meta, storytelling, very self referential. And as a matter of fact, one of the other characters that's resurrected or comes in a new form is Agent Smith. It's a different actor playing him, Jonathan Groff, than Hugo Weaving in the first three films. But as he sits talking about why, so one of the premises is the Matrix was a series of video games that were so successful, they need to make a sequel. And Warner Brothers, the literal film company who's made this film, they're saying in the movie, has said that they're going to make the sequel with or without the original creators. And so Smith sits there and he's asking Neo, do you kind of have a writer's block? Why can't you make this film or this video game? And he says, stories will never end. We're still telling the same stories with different names. So are the writers trying to say anything particularly by making the film so self-aware, which actually was very evident? I thought it was rather signposty in the marketing meeting. They have all these younger kids saying, well, yeah, we've got to have bullet time and we've got to do this and that because that's what the fans want. So it seems very self-aware, particularly the exposition of the first part of the film that's setting up what's going to happen.
Yeah, this is where Resurrections begins to get very Matrix-y. In this new Matrix, where Neo is trapped with these memories of the originals, his day job is as a successful video game designer. And one of the ways that he's coped with and explores his old memories is by turning the events of the old films, the original trilogy, into a video game series. And the company he works for now wants to make a sequel to the video games. So you can see the obvious self-awareness of the storytelling here. In interviews, I think it was the producer. I was reading an interview with one of the film's producers. No, that's actually wrong. It was with the director, Lana Wachowski, who talked about how Warner Brothers has asked every year since the original trilogy ended, every year, if another Matrix film would be made. And the realization that eventually another Matrix film was going to be made with or without the original creators attached to it, which is one of the things that sort of prompted the return. So Resurrections is very, very self-aware in that way. Now, a lot of people I know from reviews I've read are really getting hung up on this. But really, it's a very small part of this film. Sure. Do they have something to say? Yeah, there is an element here of commenting on the current state of blockbuster movie making, where everything has to be a sequel or a reboot or something like that. The cheapening of narratives for the sake of commercialism. But that is ultimately not what this movie is about. It's an idea that's in this film, and it's a tantalizing idea. But the Matrix film series has always been a very earnest film series. And the self-awareness here goes even to another level. I mean, this film opens pretty much the same way the first film opens. Some of the shots and the camera angles are identical until you start to realize that it's not quite playing out the same way. And new characters begin breaking into scenes people saw back in 1999. And there's a point to all that in the narrative. It's a very clever way of twisting the reboot idea around. The only problem I have with skinning Resurrections as a movie that's just trying to be clever, which is how some critics have taken it, is the fact that the narrative really deepens the themes of the original trilogy. The meta-ness, and we laugh about this word, I despise this word. I only recently became aware of this when someone said to me that something like that's so meta, and I had a momentary crisis of thought where I had to suddenly reevaluate everything. Look, When stories were self-aware or self-referential, it wasn't meta. That was called continuity and narrative awareness. But now it's meta. It's the same way with narrative twists. What used to be a twist in a story, people now call a retcon or a retroactive continuity, which is not even correctly applied in most cases. For example, someone I was talking to about resurrection said, well, they retcon Neo's death. No, they didn't. Neo died. He was reconstructed by the analyst. That is not a rewriting of established continuity. That is twisting and then continuing the narrative. A rewriting of established continuity would say the last 10 minutes of revolutions never happened and then would pretend like something else happened and would continue the story from that point. So that's not what they do. And, the last time I checked, that's just how you tell a story. Let me diverge for just a moment and sort of demonstrate the absurdity of this. And there is a point to what I'm saying. When Noah, for example, gets drunk and ends up naked and ashamed in a garden, we don't go, oh, that's so meta. We understand the narrative of Scripture as being self-referential to make a very specific point. We understand the imagery of being naked and ashamed in a garden, and we build on that. And other characters in the story of Scripture are going to come along and go back to the garden and reference it in a way that shows they are aware of what nakedness connotes. Unless we think that Isaiah, for example, just happens to come up with this metaphor of being clothed in righteousness and what it means, the significance of being clothed by God himself. He did not just dream that up from the other. The way that stories are told does not change and has not changed. What changes and has changed is how we perceive and read them. It shows a shallowness on the part of the viewer and the critic who cannot move beyond the self-referential nature of the story and actually see the earnestness of the narrative being told. And there's a very worthwhile story being told here. We just all need to grow up and probably read a chapter of classic literature rather than watch another TikTok video. I really do mean this. I tell my students all the time, the best way to prepare yourself to read the Bible is not to pick up a commentary or a Bible dictionary. It is to go read literature. Nearly 50% of the Bible is narrative literature. The other 50% of it deals with what happens in that 50% that is narrative literature. If you don't know how stories work on a basic level, from plot to characters to dialogue, you're really going to struggle reading and interpreting the Bible. And you're really going to struggle reading and interpreting stories or movies in general. And that, I think, is what we see happening today. We are a very illiterate people in that sense. And I think we see it on full display with the Matrix Resurrections, which seems to be very confusing for a lot of people. Now, whether that's because the narrative fails to communicate its intentions clearly is up for debate, but all this getting lost in the self-referential nonsense profoundly misses the point of the narrative, which really centers itself on this relationship between Neo and Trinity and what love can do.
Well, speaking of Neo and Trinity, some of the interpretations in the media by reviewers is addressing, and the proverbial, I think we'll have to talk about the elephant in the room. When the first series of Matrix films were made, they were made by two brothers they weren't really known by the first names. They were really known as the Wachowski Brothers. I mean, that's what you knew. Oh, the Wachowski Brothers made Matrix. Since that time, in 20 years, they have declared that they are transgender, and both of them have transitioned to identify as female, now known as Lana Wachowski and Lily Wachowski. And both of them had been on each of the previous three films, directing and writing. Only Lana Wachowski was involved in the making of this film. And so we are seeing a lot, or I did see a lot online, about the subtext of this film really being free now in 2021 for Lana Wachowski to say that this is an allegory in some regard to trans identity struggles, is how it's been known. And one of those things that I read about, so you mentioned Trinity is the love interest, and also in this new Matrix, she's portrayed as a suburban mom in San Francisco named Tiffany, whose husband's name is Chad. And there's a lot of chatter that's very interesting that Lana Wachowski chose the name Chad because Chad is known in, I learned a new word, incels, use the word Chad to identify with hyper-masculinity, and that, Neo is always seen more of androgynously, I guess. And so that's kind of been the narrative, that this has been really a way in which Lana Wachowski can talk about her transness. And I don't know, is that what it is? Because when I saw an interview with Lana Wachowski, and also if you look to the very end of the film, there's a dedication and it says, "To Mom and Dad." And the interview that I saw with Lana said that this was a way, making this film Resurrections was a way in which I could deal with grief over my parents' death, which happened really close together. I think one of the parents died, and then a little bit more than a month later, their other parent died. And so Lily the brother, or excuse me, the other sibling, didn't want to be involved in this film. So it was only Lana. And so this is what I hear Lana saying, that it's about the death, but yet I'm reading that it's really about queer theory and transgender identity. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think this is a film that is really going to, in a sense, show the true colors of where a lot of film critics are, and which is something I've bemoaned for a while. When you were talking, the one interview I kept going back to is the same one you ended up referencing, where Lana Wachowski says that the inspiration for this film was the death of the parents. There were three deaths. I think it was a parent, a friend, and then a parent, very close together, and it was pretty hard time. And based on what Lana said, she could not have her parents back, but Neo and Trinity were there, and this story was a way of working through something you couldn't have, or loss or grief. And the whole transgender issue, from what I saw, never came up. There was a separate interview that I did read with the two co-writers on the film, where these kinds of questions were sort of forced upon them by the interviewer, and both writers sort of steered away from it. And when the interviewer kept pushing on whether or not especially the red pill stuff, which I guess became a sort of like a buzzword on Reddit or something like that for some of these far right wing groups. I'm not really sure what all that was about, but this interviewer kept pushing this topic of, are you trying to, in the film, rescue the red pill from the right wingers, basically. Again, the writers kept steering away from this question, but the interviewer kept pushing the point, which just shows you we are far, far less interested in actually following a narrative and a plot and seeing what a story is about than we are inserting in whatever we want to talk about into the narrative. As far as the Chad nonsense you mentioned at the beginning, I mean, my gosh, the character Chad is played by Chad Stahelski, who was, as far as I know, Keanu Reeves' stunt double in the original trilogy. So I don't think there's any deeper thing to it than that. We're a culture that is obsessed with this word called subtext, which in other words says you kind of have to lift up the plain reading and look at what's underneath it. In a lot of respects, I would say, well, if you're looking for stuff that's not there, it seems like a lot of work when all you could do is just read the text. But that's just me. Well,
and I think that was also referred to in terms of, there's this character now called, the analyst, and in terms of not analytical data, but somebody who's like a shrink, somebody who's a therapist, just this idea of, oh, Neo's so depressed, and so he needs to free himself from that. He's trying to free himself from that depression. I mean, a lot was made of that whole setup in terms of him going to therapy.
So I was having another conversation with someone else who had seen the film about this character, the analyst. It's really kind of interesting. And one of the things I find myself constantly reminding people as we're watching films, I think in one of our previous interviews, I mentioned this about Black Panther, where someone will say, well, Killmonger was right. And I'm going, no, Killmonger was dead. the narrative refutes that ideology. The same thing came up with the analyst in this film, where the analyst is talking about all that people want is control, that kind of thing. The point of his character is to give you the theme of the movie, which is apparently to rise up and rebel against some invisible overlord and free your mind, like Neo and Trinity. Well, if that's the case, if you're going to take half of what he says as the point of the movie, then you're going to have to take the other half on top of that. You got to be consistent here in your reading of characters and dialogue. So let's go back to those therapy sessions, like you mentioned. If the purpose is that the analyst is kind of right in the end, I mean, are you going to go as far as to say that his therapy sessions with Neo are actually good? What he's doing is actually good when it's very clearly not? It's keeping Neo suppressed. You got to be consistent in your reading of the thing. But I did see some stuff online as well where people were really getting hung up on the therapy sessions, which I do find kind of interesting because the techniques being used there to sort of keep Neo hindered are techniques that we would encourage people to use. We would tell people to go to therapy and work through some things in the way that he's doing in the movie because it has good results. See, this is the problem with subtext. I don't think if you lift that up and look at it and you start going, oh, well, are the writers secretly saying that all therapy is bad? No, of course not. It's a plot device. It's being used in this context by a villain to keep Neo's mind suppressed. I don't think there's any meta commentary there on the nature of therapy in general. I think you have to keep things in context and just apply a little bit of common sense.
One of the things in this new film, Resurrections, is there's really a focus on Neo and Trinity's relationship, their love story. There's still action, maybe not as much, audacious action in previous films. So is there anything that is being said by the writers or the director, Lana Wachowski, by really focusing on their relationship? And it's interesting. They replace all the other characters with different younger actors, but not Neo and Trinity.
Yeah, it's interesting. It is a smaller scale, much more like the first Matrix film, which when you go back and watch it, it really is scaled down in a lot of ways from the sequels. The first film feels very gritty. The second and third sort of become sleeker, but then Resurrections has that kind of gritty texture to it again. I mentioned earlier that Resurrections is a true sequel. It's not a reboot or anything like that, and it really deepens the themes of the original trilogy. Well, the way the film does this is through this relationship between Neo and Trinity. Again, it's about shifting perspectives in a way that is really subtly subversive and interesting. So, to illustrate this, let's go back to the messianic idea that floats through this series. Neo in the original trilogy is said to be the One. Now, to get really technical for a second, in The Matrix, the One is called the Prime Program. And basically what that meant in the original trilogy is that the Matrix itself takes all of these anomalies and codes and funnels them into a single being to keep them from spreading. That being is then given an avatar within the Matrix and is controlled by the machines. But the humans seek to free that person because that avatar wields amazing powers because of the anomalous code inside the Matrix. Now, why is any of that important? Because in Resurrections, when Neo and Trinity are reinserted into the Matrix, Trinity receives part of Neo's anomalous code. And what that means is the One is what Neo and Trinity become when they are together. It's no longer a single individual, it is both of them. Okay, but how does that deepen the themes of the original trilogy? Well, about midway through Resurrections, Neo encounters an old enemy. This new incarnation, like you mentioned, of the older Agent Smith, formerly played by Hugo Weaving. Smith is this renegade program that tried to take over the Matrix in the original trilogy. The way that Neo achieved peace between humans and the machines was by sacrificing himself to stop this renegade program from taking over the Matrix on behalf of the machines. A new version of Smith has weaseled his way into the narrative once again. As he's talking to Neo in Resurrections, he begins talking about binaries, opposites, black and white. And he's become obsessed with them, embracing his role as the necessary antagonist to Neo's protagonist. However, by the film's end, Smith actually comes around to helping Neo defeat the Analyst to free Trinity. So he shifts his perspective. He ceases to see himself as the antagonist when he realizes that he and Neo are more or less want the same thing, shaded slightly differently, but the analyst poses a threat to them both. And that's what these movies have always been so good at disrupting, is the usual conventions of neat dichotomies. Is it predestination or is it free will? Well, the answer to that question, one way or the other, is to be a bit reductionistic. It's much more interesting to entertain the idea of the two working in tandem and in conversation with one another than it is to say, well, it's all fate or it's all autonomy. And Resurrections continues these ideas and these themes very well.
Well, one of the ways in which Neo is born is he out of the pod when he comes back to life is that he's also they're assisted, the humans are assisted by another robot. So is that something that the other robots know about, and they know that in order to get this program, that's part of, the plan of the whole thing, that they'll allow it?
Yeah, so this comes up in some of the lines of dialogue in the movie is humans and machines are now working together. So after the machine civil war, some of the machines left and sort of joined the humans, and now humans and machines have been coexisting for a while, sort of working together. Zion, the last bastion of humanity in the old films, has long since fallen, and the old Morpheus has since died. And there's a new city called Io that is run by Niobe, who was a side character in the original trilogy. And so some of these machines have been exiled or outcasts. And I'm pretty sure one of the lines of dialogue says that the machine that rescues Neo, that was sort of their escape. They sacrificed everything to get Neo out once he was found. So there's a lot of ideas in this one that sort of pushes the envelope forward a little bit and envisions a future where humans and machines are trying to coexist, whereas 20 years ago or 60 years ago, within the context of the film's narrative, it was either like an us or them mentality.
Well, one of the things that is part of, the interest in these films is their mythic overtones. They obviously have used these kinds of stories like messianic figures, especially when we're talking about Neo. And we mentioned this a little bit in our discussion about Dune, about how sometimes those kind of messianic tropes are really put on their heads and flipped in ways in which people interpreting them as a messianic trope is not even correct. So how does Matrix Resurrections subvert some of this in really different ways? Can you talk about how it flips some of those tropes?
Sure. So the biggest and obvious one is the concept of the one. This is where things like the Animatrix will help you to take a 30,000 foot overview of this entire story that these films tell. The Matrix we are dealing with in the original trilogy is the sixth iteration of the Matrix. There have been matrices before, and there will be matrices after. It's not the first time it's happened, and there has never been there's always been a one in that sense. There's always been some kind of messianic figure who kind of comes along and has the ability to free the minds of the humans who were trapped there. Again, the way that this works in the story is that the computer program funnels all of the anomalous code into one entity, into one location, and then sort of controls that location so that it doesn't spread. And so the humans seek to free that avatar to unlock all of these abilities. So that is how the one works in the Matrix universe, this messianic figure. What Resurrections does is it sort of splits some of that anomalous code up. In other words, when Trinity is re-uploaded to the Matrix alongside Neo, she receives some of his code. So now they have to be together in order for the one to really happen. And you see this at the very end of the movie. That's sort of the big moment at the end, after Trinity has sort of had her moment where she realizes the truth that everything, her life, her husband, her children, it's all fake, it's all a fabrication. And she sides with Neo, and they're running to get out of the Matrix. They're trying to get out of the Matrix, and they're fleeing together. By the end of the movie, Neo has not had his ability to fly. for the entire film, which was very iconic in the original trilogy. He could fly. They're sort of trapped on this building top and they leap off together. But it's not Neo who flies, it's now Trinity. The very end of the film is that Neo has regained his ability and they're both flying together. It really subverts the idea of the expectation as being the expectation of the one as being a literal one. It's now two. But there's a narrative reason for that. So it's not just subversion for the sake of subversion. There is a kind of a logic to it within the context of the film's narrative.
So I just want to go back and review just like the last 20 years since the very first film was released. All of these films have been pretty popular and always in the, cultural zeitgeist. Do you think the films have changed with the times? Because unlike the recent Spider-Man film, which for our listeners, we will be covering in a few weeks, this particular film, Resurrections, is not performing as well at the box office. So is it not resonating with the new generation?
Just to look at how the films have changed, obviously the technology has changed dramatically. You can see the vast improvements on the CGI when you hold it up against the original trilogy. But these movies have always been a product of their time. The originals came out right on the cusp of the year 2000 and Y2K and all of that. So there was a time when the pace of life was a little slower and there was a little more skepticism about technology. Today, technology has been so wildly and rapidly embraced, which ironically we're meta, if we're calling it that, is exactly what these movies sort of presaged. Humanity's downfall in the Matrix series is brought about in no small part due to runaway technological advancements. However, with Resurrections, the question becomes about how humans and machines can coexist. The original film ends with humanity having a chance to fight back against this domineering technology, and Resurrections ends with humanity having a chance at coexistence. So in that respect, I think there's a general sense of acceptance in the air that technological innovation isn't going away. The trick now is to innovate well and to do it ethically in whatever form that takes. I was just going to say, I also don't think these films are ever going to get out from under the banner of the transgender conversation. Not now. At least not in the near future, considering that, both of the original directors, born as men, now identify as women. Like we talked about, practically every headline about these movies now makes some reference to gender. When one of the headlines stems from an interview that one of these directors did with Netflix, where it said that the original intention was to emphasize some of the more transgender qualities in the storytelling, but that the world was not quite ready, or the corporate people weren't quite ready. Even in that interview, the director says that the current state of transgender conversations were likely not influencing the direction of the earlier movies, or at least not on an obvious level. So, of course, the headlines in the media as a result, many film critics are rewriting these movies and their narrative themes to fit within this transgender conversation. And, I find that a bit tiring myself. You're never going to convince me the original trilogy is a transgender allegory. I'm sorry, it's just not going to happen. So in that sense, I do think the films have not necessarily changed, but the audience definitely has. Like you just mentioned, it's not doing anywhere near as well with Spider-Man, which is a very anticipated Marvel movie. In fact, I do think it is actually quite ironic. We'll use the word meta. I do find it a bit meta and ironic that this film is released in theaters alongside Spider-Man, which really is sort of the zenith of the kind of sequelizing that The Matrix sort of pokes fun at. It's sort of very ironic that these two films are in theaters at the same time. And of course, The Matrix is not doing as well. And what's funny is the disposition of the film is that it kind of knows it wouldn't do well. And that's sort of why they made it. I find that very interesting.
Well, I'm just wondering about The Matrix as a property, as an IP, because you were saying that in the past, like video games have been very faithful to the storytelling. I'm just, they definitely said that those years ago, they're not going to do another one. And yet here they are 20 years later. Well, at least Lana is, Wachowski, making this film. Will it continue on? Because it seems to me that they've had a lot of the upper hand. Normally, these kinds of series, become the properties of these, corporate entertainment things. And then we have, like we do in the Marvel universe and the Star Wars. Now you have the Mandalorian on TV, or you have WandaVision, or all these different things. And there's so much to be said about the Matrix, and maybe they could continue to build the brand. But is that something that the Wachowskis want to do? Do they want to build this brand to make it into Netflix TV series and animated series and backstories and more video games, that kind of thing?
No, I don't think they do. I mean, they sort of dabbled in all of that 20 years ago, and it was, pretty successful then, but I think they've it took a pretty serious life event for Lana Wachowski to come back and do this one. Who's to say? As far as should it go on and that kind of thing, honestly, I don't think it should, and that has nothing to do with the fact that I'm tired of sequels, even though that's certainly true. I was talking with a friend who saw the film after we both watched it, and one of the things we agreed on is that we think Resurrections works as a great epilogue. It's a wonderful little coda to the original trilogy, or a final chapter in the story, however you want to look at it. The original trilogy ended with Neo and Trinity sacrificing everything, and this film ends with Trinity and Neo actually thanking the analyst for giving them a second chance. It's a pretty comical final scene, too, right, when they confront the analyst and he gives this monologue about how their victory will be very short-lived and all that. And then they just kind of laugh and say that they came to thank him for giving them a second chance, and he's completely caught off guard by this. He can't process this bizarre human emotion that he has inadvertently given two people happiness. It's a really interesting note to end on, but it works. I really think it works as an ending to this series and as an ending for these characters. But like you said, I think it's kind of inevitable that a series this successful will eventually continue. I guess we'll just have to wait and see in what form that takes.
It'll be interesting to see if they can ever convince the original filmmakers to come back yet another time. I know that the other Wachowski, Lily, is working in television now, but didn't have any room or interest, I think, to do this particular film. Lana made it, just solo. So I will be very much interested to see what happens in the future if they do a lot of backstory stuff on Netflix in the form of TV shows or something like that. Well, finally, I have some fun rapid fire questions for Cole, which is a way in which our listeners can help get to know our writers better. And I want to ask you a question that was asked of Keanu Reeves on the press tour. Someone asked Keanu to give his ethical answer to this. If someone cuts you in line, do you speak up or say nothing?
I say nothing.
And as I mentioned, it's just starting 2022. So what's something you want to enjoy in 2022?
I haven't really thought about it. I've been so busy. Something I would like to enjoy, a vacation. I think I'm going to take a vacation finally.
Well, thanks, Cole, for being a guest on the Postmodern Realities podcast.
Always a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
You've been listening to episode 269 of the Postmodern Realities podcast. Our discussion has been about the new film, The Matrix Resurrections. Today's guest was Cole Burgett. He's written an online exclusive film review, and we're going to make that free for everyone at our website, equip.org. It's called The Matrix Resurrections, Self-Awareness and Romance in the Digital Age. So please do feel free to share that article widely on your social media so people can get a taste of the kind of articles that we have for our subscribers. And this one, of course, is again free online at our website, equip.org.